One of the things that I was so inspired by, one of the so many things, obviously, that I was so inspired by in India, and I was incredibly envious of, I still am so envious, was the fact that, the architecture and the culture is fiercely alive.
So to start with, thank you very Miriam for joining us today. It's a real pleasure to speak to you. We actually wanted to start with one of the statements you made. You've gone on record to say, with reference to administrative buildings that were constructed as a result of colonization, um, how the Neo-Sudanese architecture is derived as a mere imaginary of buildings found locally. How do you instigate your buildings from moving beyond this symbolism of architecture that strives to represent a notion of native, right? Not actually native. Because there was a very interesting statement of what post-colonial, a contemporary narrative of what post-colonial architecture should be.
I mean, that is the whole job, essentially, right? It is really about trying to make the distinction between symbolism, as you put it, and just almost of a pastiche approach to representing some kind of local identity rather than really getting to the heart of what does that actually mean? Stepping away from sort of a visual representation simply, because architecture is not just about what you see. We are makers of space, right? So I think for me, the struggle has been, how to have only the tools to make the kind of spaces and that kind of expressions that are relevant to a more Western setting, but then also how to use what I know of the local culture and history to turn that into an architecture that could read almost as this hybrid of, yes, we've been colonized, so it's not about erasing that. And it's not about going back 200 years either. It's about trying to come up with a 21st century expression of what that could look like, or in my view, should look like. And I think what's happened in cities like mine is that we spent the past 60 years post-colonization just trying to show that we are capable of being contemporary, that we are capable of being sort of, worthy of either respect or consideration or something like that. And the answer, and this is not unique to here, it's pretty much a global problem. The answer is to look like, the closest you can get to your street looking perfectly like a European street, to your administrative building looking like administrative, European buildings, etc. The closer you get to quote unquote seeming civilized. And sadly, this is still largely the case. So the work that we embark on is really sort of almost of a forensic approach where you're really trying to understand deeply what is it that even made the buildings of yesteryear? What is it that made them what they are, right? It's not, again, not just about the aesthetic of them and the motifs, and all of that, but it was about the use of them. It was about the type of people who used them, and it was about the cultural needs and the cultural habits that went along with that. But just as importantly, and perhaps even more importantly, it's also about the climate and the geography of the place. Architecture has always been about that. We've freed ourselves from that only about 100 years ago. For forever and ever, it's always been about sheltering you from the elements, which means that it was a response to a climate. So I ended up realizing that a very simple way to go about it is to actually start there, is to start with the climate and then look at the cultural habits. When you have those two elements, you're most of the way there, and you don't have to worry about, this motifs or these aesthetics as a way of making an architecture that seems to be of a place. You can actually focus on making spaces that make sense in terms of how they deal with the weather, that can age gracefully also, because again, they deal well with the weather rather than the cities we have currently, which the minute you build something within 2 years, it looks like it's decaying because everything is made out of concrete, but concrete only functions really in a certain type of weather. For the rest of us who are in hot weathers, either hot and dry, like here, desert weather, or even worse, tropical weather where it rains a lot and it's really warm, it decays rapidly. And it's the material's fault. It's not our fault. I feel like also there's also this feeling that somehow it's because also we're not capable of dealing with these kinds of buildings. We're not sophisticated enough, or something like that, that our cities are decaying. But the reality is that they're simply A, incredibly expensive to make because of these materials, and B, they're completely unadapted to the climate. It's really that simple. So this is a long roundabout way of
No,
sort of addressing the question.
no, I think the idea you spoke about of creating space and not building, I think that was visible in the Biennale installation as well, which was a space and not a built space per se, which certainly resonates very well.
Yes, because I think ultimately also one of the aspects of the work that we do is very much focused on this notion of, yes, identity, but actually this notion of unearthing the value that is there locally in terms of the skills that are there locally, rather than, again, going from the idea that somehow we need to go learn. We need to go learn how to make these buildings a certain way. We need to go. But the reality is we have incredibly talented people everywhere who have incredible skill passed down from generations to generations. And in a way, as designers, we have to not be lazy, and just go for the easy thing that we learn in school that we can get from a catalog, or something like that. And actually take that as an opportunity to learn new design approaches based on what the skills are locally, and then see how our design can actually be used with these local skills. Because every time we work on a project, for example, in Niger, which we know very well, every line I draw, I try to figure out, could a local mason make this? If the answer is that they cannot, and that somehow I need to import someone from somewhere to come train people to do this, then I already know that what I'm designing is not the correct answer.
So I'd like to move on to your postgraduate thesis, Mobile Loitering, a response to public space needs in Niger's post-colonial, highly gender urban context, which is a project that not only enables women to occupy streets, which are primary public spaces in a city like Niamey, but it also does so within, the conforms of social norms. And while this kind of design solution, may invariably reiterate the existing status quo, it is undeniably a step towards liberating a marginalized group of people. So actually, my question to you would be, do you think, however, that architecture has the potential to play a more radical role in sort of altering this status quo?
I think so, because if we think about it, architecture and urban planning and urban design have been used as tools to reinforce either lack of access to spaces, segregation, in uses of spaces. They were the tools that were used to do that. So then it goes hand in hand that they could also be the tools to help undo that, and to help sort of, and again, these are things that we see a lot in cities that were built for colonization, or for exploitation or for control. If you look in South Africa, for example, the cities are built, the planning is made so that you can control a local population and make sure that that local population cannot organize an uprising against you. So there were certain strategies in where you allow people to go, and how you design where they live and where they get to, conduct business, congregate and socialize. In a city like Niger, I think, or in a city like Niamey rather, one of the issues is that we have a colonially made city, which was made for exploitation, which means that it doesn't have any public spaces. It doesn't really have, you have housing, you have administrative spaces, and you have economic, commercial spaces. And so the question then becomes, what does that mean for how you go about using the city and how you go through the city? And in a context where largely the population is largely Muslim, in the beginning, it wasn't necessarily a problem, but we're a society that has actually started becoming a bit more traditional over time, especially recently, over the past 20 years roughly, where then there's this question of the place of a young woman in public or in the streets, and what does that mean? And the reason why I asked myself that question was because we have this cultural habit in Niger where people sit in front of their home, all day long, but it tends to be young men. And they sit there and they're drinking tea and they're playing cards. And sometimes it goes on until really the wee hours of the morning. And I remember being a teenager and being so envious of that and just thinking, oh, I wish I could also do that. But there was this idea that if you as a woman were seen sitting there and partaking in that activity, there was something kind of morally wrong with that somehow. And so for the architectural project, what I started thinking about was that, or realizing was that this was a multi-layered problem. It's not just about religion. It's not just about, it's about also the tension that was created between public space use, women, and colonization, for example. So this is a place where if you have a cafe, it will be really rare to see women sitting outside of it. And it's actually not because of religion. So it was also about disentangling what was coming from what, because it's easy to just say, oh, it's Islam, it's the religion, that's kind of, and I ended up realizing that that's actually not the reason. The reason was that during colonization, the only women who were in these kinds of spaces like cafes and the small, the few public spaces there were prostitutes with the Europeans, because the Europeans lived in the city, they created those spaces, they used those spaces, and they had female company because they did not bring their spouses. And the female company were prostitutes. And so it created this idea in the psyche, in the local psyche, that women seen in these kinds of places are loose morally. So all of that put together, then it started becoming this introspection of, well, how do we use actually public spaces as women? What is it that we're, in which conditions or in which circumstances are we able to have the right to the city? And I remember that when I was a teenager, what we did was just walk around the neighborhood endlessly for 2-3 hours at a time. We're just walking. There's no aim, there's no destination. And we were just walking around, and it was our way of loitering. So that's why I called the project mobile loitering. It was actually the equivalent of sitting in front of your home and watching the world go by, except we actually got to see a lot more of the world. It was incredibly pleasant thing to do. And so I started imagining, well, what if actually this became amplified rather than it being something that you do every once in a while with your friends, but we actually insert that within an architecture and urban design project that takes this strategy that is already naturally there culturally, that this behavior that young girls have, and then take that, add program to it, destinations that they can have, but the destinations are also in the public realm, and see how those two can come together, because the destinations are quote unquote legitimate program. So it might be places to study, it might be places, to exercise, or, other things that no one would frown upon. And so the ultimate goal of this approach was to not say, oh, women have the right to the city like everybody else. So, we just need to strike down the patriarchy and do that. We can say that, but it's not really going to yield results. We know that. And so I was trying to figure out, how do you make a long-term process where actually their presence in the public realm is normalized? It's a psychological game in some sense.
You did mention that you've spent some time in India. I was just wondering if you saw similar or observed similar trends in India, because I'm sure Dhwani and I could add our own why loiter in cities like
Yes. Oh, I remember the first time I went to India, it felt that I was in one of our neighboring countries, Ivory Coast, because climate-wise is very similar. The trees were the same, the street vendors were the same. It was the same thing with like the Fanta, Coca-Cola, and Maggie, like signs. it was incredible. I couldn't believe it. And it just felt like another home away from home, somehow. So it was very familiar and it was very familiar, and it helped me really understand, again, these forces at play, this kind of post-colonial condition. There's a reason why our cities all look the same, because all of us are trying, again, to fulfill this, looking like the Western, project. But then economically, that's not viable. It's incredibly expensive to make a city that looks like theirs. And the only reason why they were able to do that was because they were able to exploit countries like ours and get resources and capital for free. We don't get to have resources and capital for free. So this is literally a trap, what we're trying to do, right? And then the answer is that, okay, well, you need spaces for commerce. The spaces cannot look like these perfect shops, along streets, and all that you see in the Western world. So people make do with what they have. So they have, metal shacks, they have, this kind of temporary stands, everything is open because also it needs to breathe. It's hot, it's humid. And so the tactics end up being the same. And because also the same companies, use us as, so it's this, it's the same Western companies or, other kind of conglomerates for whom we are the markets. So the exact same advertisements and the exact same sort of tropes end up being visible everywhere. But one of the things that I was so inspired by, one of the so many things, obviously, that I was so inspired by in India, and I was incredibly envious of, I still am so envious, was the fact that, the architecture and the culture is fiercely alive, the pre-colonial architecture and culture, and fiercely alive. And it's a setting where there is really, and there has been a very serious effort to conjugate both a local identity and also a desire for modernity and for moving forward to this day. And there's something incredibly powerful about that to me, we could really learn from as countries who are relatively 20, 30 years behind you in terms of development, economic development, and sort of, figuring out these different notions. And I actually started studying India much earlier than that, because at some point I was going to study political science and economics. And I figured that actually, rather than trying to emulate Western models of economics and politics and all that, this should be a lateral investigation, meaning emerging market versus emerging market. So I looked to India, I looked to other countries in South America, because really we're having the same challenges. It's really the struggle of trying to figure out how to proudly be yourself, but how to also be of the times, how to be contemporary, how to also even usher in, this amazing future. This is what we're all looking for. And so India was also an incredible blueprint for me when it comes to that. And so then also a lot of the architects whose work I was looking at, even when I was in architecture school, were from India. So whether it was the sadly late Balakrishna Doshi as of yesterday, or Charles Correa, I was just looking at what they were doing, what they were thinking, because they were also doing it a little bit after independence. And there was something also incredibly important and interesting about that, about this introspection and, just really trying to answer this question of what now? So we were under, this rule for so long where we did not own ourselves. Now we belong to ourselves again. How do we move forward? And what does that look like? And for us, this is a question that we're still trying to answer. It feels, because there's kind of this new economic impulse in Africa, it's a time for a do-over almost. We feel like we're going through a second decolonization. And this is yet a new dawn again, where we get to start over again.
I'd like to talk now about one of your more recent projects, or rather upcoming project, which is the Betwe Museum, which is another instance of architecture that sort of amalgamates historically native gestures within the design itself. So could you elaborate a little bit on the design process and how it responds to the idea of being contemporary architecture in Niamey?
So I think really for me, Bet B is a continuation of everything that I've been doing, and the same approach to architecture, because what I'm really concerned with is to trying to figure out, do I actually understand the context in which I'm about to build? Do I understand the forces at play? And by understand, I don't mean, like a native of the place. Obviously, that's not possible. But am I really understanding the forces at play? Am I understanding the different layers, that affect this site and this type of program and this type of project? And so we spend a lot of time investigating that, a few months before we even start the project design, to also help uncover opportunities. Like I said, whether it's in trying to find makers, local skills, and trying to understand them and how they actually make it, so that it can inform the design decision. So in a way, it was really kind of an extension of the work that we already do in Niamey from that point of view. It was the exact same approach, but then it's a completely different expression. It doesn't look like anything that I would do in Niamey. If the same project was for Niger, there's no way it would look like that. Because it was just really drawing from some of the really, really ancient religious sort of thoughts and relationship to space, to sacrality, to ritual, which we don't have at all, on this side. And so it was incredibly fascinating to try to see, how to kind of put all of that together, because the central question was, for a place like that, what is art really? And then why is it important? Which we've been asking the question for a long time everywhere. We know why it's important, but why would it be important there? And why would anybody go to this museum? Because museums, again, are kind of like sort of a Western invention. And it's a Western invention because they had to house all of the looted artifacts from their colonial empires or outposts. We don't have any of that history. And it was really made this grand, because they didn't have museums either under colonization. They had these salons where, artists would come and showcase their work, and it would last for a month and then it would disappear. There was no permanent receptacle until colonization. And so this permanent receptacle and this habits of museum going was this thing of, oh, come look at all these curiosities from our empire. So then your empire, you own all of these things. Come look at it. And they're still there now. Okay. So then now the question is, well, what is it even relevant then to a place like here? Because all these things that are in museums are actually daily artifacts. I've seen things in museums in Paris that are still used in villages in Niger today. So does it actually make sense? So I started realizing also because this is a question I've been really thinking about for at least 10 years, the whole museum, it really bothers me. And I was actually even hesitant to do the competition, to enter the competition for the project for that reason, because I just was not sure that this was something to be done. But then I started realizing that at the end of the day, the ship has sailed. Museums are here to stay now. It's kind of like this new way of relating to the product of creativity. And so then the question for me became how to make a space that could house these amazing products of creativity and make them accessible in such a way that is not intimidating, that it doesn't make and museums are intimidating in most parts of the world, because they're trying to be grandiose and kind of, really kind of make a statement, But I started realizing that more important than the museum itself, than the art itself, was community life. Creating a space that would bring people together, that will allow them to be there as families, children, everyone, friends, was much more important than creating a place for making art. So the project just became a public space for that reason, that you can come to and picnic, and just hang out in this beautiful setting, where you could watch also plays, you could watch shows, and things like that. And then the museum is this thing that is secondary, and that you should be able to get glimpses of, whether you go inside or not. And then the glimpses are supposed to entice you actually to go inside. And you see, there would be an opening, you would see artwork, down below, because the museum is buried underground for also other reasons. And you can just go through this journey where actually you could see the entire content of the museum from outside if you wanted to. And then you can elect to go inside again if you wanted to. And that should be okay, because the being in the space and being with community is more important, at least in that particular setting.
Talk now about the Haiyan Master Plan, which is again another project that is completely is a completely different scale as compared to the Bethe Museum. It's a master plan, like I said, and it's also designed keeping in mind the local context. But could you throw some light on the design strategy with reference to climate, privacy, and culture? Because I read somewhere that these were the aspects that were sort of taken into consideration while also looking at the local context.
Yeah, and I mean, this one was a really big learning exercise also, for me once again, because this is a context, ironically, where climatically, I'm very familiar, very comfortable with that, because it's the same climate as Niger. It's the desert. But then economically, it could not be any different. And so there was just kind of this dialogue that needed to happen between the two. And what does that mean? But then I decided quite quickly that actually it doesn't matter as much as it looks like it matters. It's just a matter of scale and access to amenities, and things like that. And we can do more. But ultimately, the culture was kind of the driving, for everything, right? The culture and the climate. So for the climate, it was really about, okay, not having like all these glass, all this glass everywhere, and having these massive windows. So it's like we'll have like a whole home, and there's like one big window, that just captures everything, and that will be that. I mean, one or two or three, but just very limited. The expression is very much one that, again, just because there's a lot of economic means doesn't mean that we should be wasteful. So we're very aware of the amount of material being used, but we're also very aware of energy conservation in the building of the forms of the homes, so that they are shaped in such a way that natural ventilation is always possible, that orientations are taken into account so that the openings don't take in a lot of heat and a lot of sun, that they're recessed in such a way or protected in such a way, et cetera, et cetera. But then the second thing, as I said, was the cultural aspect, and knowing that, privacy is a very important thing compared to, again, the Western model, where actually your home is almost a stage for the rest of the world, which is something when I moved to the US shocked me to no end, to be able to walk down the street and to see completely clearly inside someone's living room was unthinkable. It still shocks me today, 20 plus years later, when I see it, because culturally, it just doesn't compute. It doesn't make sense. So it was really about having these homes that are really clustered in close contact together. In a way, very similar to a project that we've already done in Niger that actually, tackled the same idea, and do it in such a way with kind of manipulating the form that you never looking directly inside someone's home, even though you have this big window. You never directly, when you're on your balcony, you're not kind of like neck to neck with the balcony next door. Actually, their balcony is on the other side, of the house, et cetera, et cetera. So you just kind of this game of like flipping things around so that you never have these direct, intrusive views into one another. And then there was also this desire to really make it as green as possible, but not waste water. And so it was also about creating opportunities for capturing water, which actually we didn't even talk about that much for capturing water, for preserving it, and for using it, with a system, kind of like an underground drip irrigation system that would go through the streets and just kind of, feed the trees and make sure that there's enough vegetation, which once again allows the temperatures to come down. And then finally, again, then going back, this was again climate, then going back to culture again, because we looked at it both from the micro, so from the home, and from the macro, because we're making an entire community 2,700 homes, so 2,700 homes. And so it was about actually making the concept be able to expand and shrink down to a house, but also expand to a neighborhood. And so from the neighborhood point of view, then it was about creating spaces again for congregation, but also spaces that are aware of the climate in the way they are used. So we designed the whole place to be somewhere you could actually use at night rather than by day. And what I mean by that is that the outdoor spaces, the lighting strategy, the kind of way in which you navigate through the streets is one where you allow, after sunset, when families, go around, taking strolls and things like that, which is something that we observe happening a lot, even in Sharjah, even downtown, you would see that a lot until 10 p.m. with children just like walking down, because that's when the temperatures allow you to walk out on the street. What could we do to make sure that this was pleasant and this was actually encouraged, so that there would be no dark corners that could be unsafe, so that there would be spaces to be able to screen movies at night, on these specific gardens that we made, so that there's again these water ponds that help to cool down the air, et cetera, et cetera. So it was really, again, this conversation about, the climate and the culture, and trying to figure out how you make a community, keeping all of those things in mind. But the whole nighttime living thing was incredibly important to the thinking of the project.
Thank you for that. I'm sure because of the lockdown, a lot got paused. So, wondering if you have any upcoming architectural projects that you could share with us at this time, or if it's all under wraps.
Yeah, I mean, some of them are under wraps. Some of them will be unveiled soon. Next month we'll be unveiling the design for the Ellen Sirleaf Johnson Presidential Center, so the first woman president in Liberia. So we just completed the design, and we'll be unveiling that next month. And we're hoping that construction will start later in the year, towards the end of the year. And then we have yeah, we have a couple of projects that will also be announced maybe in a few months that I cannot, talk about right now, but they're kind of scattered. So it's interesting. We're currently working in Brazil, for example, and it's, we're doing these cultural projects and doing a couple of other projects, one in West Africa, another one in East Africa, and they're all, again, very different from one another, which is always very exciting for me.
Yeah. And I think what's interesting is how global practice has really become, and it isn't, again, something that's restricted to perhaps the global north designing in the global south, which is what a lot of 20th century modernism was, right? And it's instead a lot more intermingled.
Exactly. I mean, to be honest with you, this is also one of my motivations. It was kind of this frustration of just being the subjects, on which, these things are applied. And somehow, if good architecture has to happen on our side of the pond, it needs to be, yeah, from the north coming south. Why can't we actually have practices over here that go there and are able to design for the global north? Why not?
Like you said, you can't imagine someone from the global south sort of designing for the global north. uh, People have the same perception about teaching as well, and we know you've been teaching at GSD in Harvard, and now recently also at the ETH Zurich, where you've been appointed to teach architectural heritage and sustainability. And in your process, you focus on the kind of inequities of the architectural canon, the fact that it is a very Eurocentric approach to design. But could you throw some light on, on this process which starts with unlearning what you've actually learned all your life?
Yeah. I mean, the unlearning, I have to tell you, is incredibly enjoyable, actually. There's something very liberating about it because also it's incredibly self-affirming. And that is very valuable and very important because it's also about you unlearn to learn something else additionally, right? And there's something else that you add tells you something about yourself or about, others that you haven't been able to learn about that really augments your set of tools as an architect. So from a teaching point of view, I think you're exactly right. There's kind of like this idea that mostly we wouldn't be able to go and teach in that context. But the exception being that usually when we are asked to teach in that context is so that we can teach the architecture that we do in our context. And this is something that I struggle with enormously. I think the first couple of times I taught, I kind of did that, but I stopped short of taking students with me to, for example, Niger, because I think there's something very problematic about doing that. And about, at some point there was this fashion of architecture studios that, especially in big schools in the US that sent students, to South America, to India, to, anywhere that seemed impoverished, quote unquote, and send them to supposed slums, and all that. And those, we used to call it slum porn, and it was just sort of literally, sending these students to go and make projects that would save us. And for me, that's an incredibly insulting thing to do. So as practitioners and as teachers, I don't think this is something we should be doing or that we should condone. So I actually had a very big moral crisis about it. And it was part of the reason why I even stopped teaching at some point, because I just did not want to do that. And the reality is there are problems everywhere. Why is it that, we think that somehow the dire conditions only exist on our parts of the world? We kind of contribute to this narrative that, again, we are the ones to be saved, and over there, everything is perfect. And it's far from it. And so with the studio in Zurich, for example, and even when I was at the GST, what I focused on was, just making sure that the sites would be local to the place I'm teaching at. So I'm not teaching architecture of Niger or from Niger. Rather, it's about what I view as a process of making architecture that actually could be used anywhere. And that process is what I talked about earlier, which is about really carefully analyzing the context, really understanding the forces at play, the different layers. They're always there. Because one of the issues really with the way that we've been teaching architecture over the past century is that we've become form obsessed, we've become image obsessed. And it's no longer about space, it's no longer about what these spaces do for people or to people. And I think actually this approach is valid anywhere. And so what I focus on in Zurich right now, for example, I'm going to start teaching next month, the first studio, is we have a site that will be in Zurich. And we would be tackling, the students will be going through an extensive amount of research in a place they think they know. But that I know, having practiced in Niger, for example, a place I grew up in, I thought I knew. When I came as a practitioner and started researching, and I realized how little I knew. And I know that the same is true, will be true, for them. And so it's about really understanding how that research can inform then the kind of solutions you put on the ground. It will not be about, just kind of making a form and it's kind of, something beautiful. It would be about what kinds of challenges do you see in this context and how can your design address them? So it's, in a sense, it's the same, but it does not have to be cited in Africa because I work a lot in Africa. But to me, that doesn't make sense.
Thank you so much. This has been, we just two more questions. We won't take more of your time. One is, will we be seeing you at any of the many festivals and exhibitions and fairs that are happening across the world now that it's open?
Right, exactly. I tend to turn down a lot of them because I'm just always having to travel for work. I was dying to go to the Islamic Biennial that just
Yeah.
opened, and unfortunately I had this massive crisis on a site here. So literally, I this weekend I had to fly to Niger. But we will be in Venice. We're doing an exhibition, in actually two exhibitions in Venice in May. We're also doing this kind of more closed exhibition in Athens just a week later that will run for about a month. And then we're also preparing a major sort of takeover of an entire building exhibition in South Africa for next year or the year after. I'm forgetting when it's scheduled, but so there's just, yeah, there'll be some of them.
And just one last question. We have, as the publication has kind of adapted a manifesto of sorts, which we call Think Next. So it's not about thinking new, it's not about thinking different, it's what comes next now. And it is building into a manifesto for us in how we write and how we kind of even then, disseminate that writing. So there's a question to you, what is next for you?
I think the position in Zurich is kind of taking me in a direction. It's not so much that it's next, it's always been on my wish list. I just didn't have the opportunities to do it because since this is sort of a tenure position with a research lab, and all of that. So that means that I'm able to put much more effort, energy, and resources behind research like I've always dreamt. And it really reaches back out to or linked to what I always talk about in terms of this single-minded tunnel vision, that we have both in architectural practice, but also in other forms of design where all the references and everything is only, one part of the world, and actually even only one era of one part of the world is supposed to be the reference for the whole world to use. And so it will be about really, in a very academic and a very scientific way, going about, and there will be a lot of publications. I think that we're embarking on a road of starting to write a lot, to make publications, to research a lot, field investigations and all that, and do our part in adding to the scholarship. And when it comes to knowledge base and references, because there are so many gaps and there are so many. I think I wrote this one opinion piece 3 years ago or something where I was talking about starting architecture, going to architecture school and buying this book called World Architecture, and 2 chapters was dedicated to the entire world, and the rest of the book was Europe and America. And the first chapter's title was Barbaric Splendor. And that barbaric splendor, it's so, I just cannot believe. The barbaric splendor is, all the architecture for like Ajanta, or the pyramids and I'm just thinking, wow, it's just the humiliation is something that is really difficult for me to deal with. And to me, 80% of the planet that we are just in the constant state of humiliation because we're condescended to 24/7 and we're essentially being told that we have no value. And one of the things that's really important for me is to not only explore that in architectural form, but also in scholarship form. So I guess that's what's next alongside the architectural practice.
That's amazing. Thank you so much for giving us your precious time and some of these incredible thoughts.